Here's our next biogeochemical cycle looking at nitrogen, right? The nitrogen cycle, and this one is a little more complex, and you need to know the different changes or the phases in the nitrogen cycle. So here you can look at how nitrogen cycles throughout. I'm going to move on to a better diagram. You can pause this and use this to study for how nitrogen flows from the biotic to the abiotic, and then back into the biotic. But I'm going to show another one to explain the nitrogen cycle. Alright, I'm going to be using this diagram here throughout to explain the nitrogen cycle, and I will be pasting it on the upper right hand corner of each slide as I go through the explanation of the different movements of nitrogen through an ecosystem. So the first part of the nitrogen cycle we're going to talk about is nitrogen fixation, and there are three kinds. There's biological nitrogen fixation, atmospheric fixation, and industrial fixation. And biological nitrogen fixation is where bacteria in soil changes atmospheric nitrogen gas, into ammonium and ammonium. Atmospheric fixation is where the sun's energy releases the nitrogen gas molecules apart and reacts with oxygen to produce nitrite or nitrate, and this only happens about 5 to 8% of all nitrogen fixation. And then you have industrial fixation that causes nitrogen gas to combine with hydrogen, and that under great heat and pressure to produce ammonia and then ammonium nitrate for fertilizers. So this one is synthetic. This is the one that humans have done and produced. These two happen naturally. So here we have a simulation. A simulation is where either that nitrate or ammonium or ammonium is assimilated into living things. Right? It could be humans or plants. Take my tree again. There's my nice tree. Yeah. Alright. So assimilation happens when plants absorb the nitrogen, and then that enters in the food chain. And nitrogen is an abundant element in our DNA and in our proteins. So assimilation is where it's assimilated into the life, into living things, into our DNA or protein. Nitrification is where you have ammonia and it is oxidized into nitrates, and that is done by bacteria. So that usually happens within the soil. Nitrates are very soluble and can be leached out of soils. So nitrification. So far we've had nitrogen fixation, assimilation, and now nitrification. Nitrification is where it goes from ammonia or ammonium to different types of nitrates. Here we have denitrification. Denitrification is where you take the nitrates, the NOx, and it is turned back into atmospheric. Alright? And this is carried out by bacteria. So here you're going from biotic to abiotic. Especially those things that do anaerobic respiration, happens in bogs and marshes, and an important ecosystem service to wetlands. Problem is 50% of nitrogen fixed today is industrial, and denitrifiers can't keep up. Eutrophication tends to result. Remember, eutrophication is where the pond gets too much nutrients, and then the plants do well, or the algae does well, they die, decomposers do well, and sediment slowly builds up, reducing the amount of space and oxygen for other larger living things within those lakes. So denitrification, assimilation, nitrification, and nitrogen fixation, are the ones that we've gone over so far. And last but not least is ammonification. Ammonification happens by decomposers. And now we are taking nitrates, turning them into ammonia or ammonium. I need to correct that. What's actually occurring here is where not nitrates are turned into ammonia, but the nitrogen within DNA is turned into ammonia through decomposers. So when things die, their nitrogen is decomposed by bacteria into ammonium. So an introduction of nitrogen fixers, bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen into usable forms of nitrogen for plants, can alter community structures. Alright, some human-induced changes with the nitrogen cycle. You can have that humans have more than doubled the amount of fixed nitrogen entering the global nitrogen cycle, contaminating groundwater through runoff. Nitrogen oxides have increased through transportation, causing an increase in photochemical smog, and acid deposition, which is also acid rain. Alright, just to review, we have nitrogen gas. Let me take that back. There we go. We got nitrogen gas, nitrogen oxides, ammonias, and nitrogen in our proteins and DNA. So when you go from, let's start out with orange, when you go from nitrogen to either nitrates or ammonias, you have nitrogen fixation. When you go from either nitrates or ammonias back into nitrogen gas, you have denitrification. Where you go from, get another color here, where you go from nitrates to ammonias, you get nitrification. Where you go from either nitrates or ammonias into DNA, you have assimilation. Oop, I said this one wrong. This one is incorrect here. Nitrification, which was my green one, is actually from ammonias into nitrates. Because the other one is ammonification. And ammonification is where you go from nitrates into ammonias. And you can have ammonification happen with decomposing things as well. So you can see here, population in red and consumption of nitrogen, they have a correlation. As our populations increase drastically, so has our consumption of nitrogen, using nitrogen as fertilizer to fertilize our crops to feed our increasing population.